Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Emma Veve. I'm Deputy Director General of the Asian Development Bank's Pacific Department, and normally I live in Manila, the Philippines. And I'm your moderator for this afternoon's session, where we're discussing the role of public investment to enhance climate and disaster resilience. At the outset of this session, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Turrbal, Jagera and Newgara peoples, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. I'm sure that by now you all know how these sessions work, but let me provide you some housekeeping reminders. When we come to question time, there's a couple of ways for people to participate. You can either sit near the front and come to microphones, or else you can submit your questions through the conference mobile application. And we'll have them moderated and ask the questions as time permits. Also, please keep your conference app handy. We're going to have a poll during this. I'll be asking a question and would be very interested to hear your responses, so please keep the app handy. So as I said, this afternoon we're going to be talking about public investments in disaster risk reduction. And I'm guessing that many of you in this room are already converts to the idea that there really should be significant public investment in this important area of disaster risk reduction. And we see that the public investments in disaster risk reduction are both responsible investments that help save lives, prevent great losses and damage, and hence are very cost-effective investments. But if you're not yet convinced that this is a good public investment, I hope by the end of the time our panel finishes the discussion, you'll be a convert to the idea. So what type of investments are we hoping to see? These can be as varied as investing in better data to understand what the risks are that are being faced. And it might allow for investments in better planning so that people don't, for example, build in risky areas. Or it could be infrastructure investments, coastal protection, stronger bridges and so forth. The whole raft of different public investments that can be made. So by focusing on prevention and risk reduction, these investments address vulnerabilities and exposure, reduce the loss of life and damage to assets, and do result in smarter investments over time. And they can also play a really important role in encouraging the private sector to come and invest in particular regions, feeling safer behind the public investments that have been made. But unfortunately, I think we all know that disaster risk reduction investments are not happening to the extent needed. Available funding is insufficient. So why? How can this be changed? And are there any success stories that could be shared? Our panellists this afternoon come from national government, local government, and academia from across Asia Pacific. And I'm going to introduce them one by one as they enter our discussion. So firstly, I would like to welcome Mayor Jenny Hill from Townsville Council in Queensland, Australia. Mayor Hill chairs the Townsville Local Disaster Management Group also, and has led this group through a number of significant events and helping to address the impacts of these. So please thank Mayor Hill for joining us. Mayor Hill, to start our discussion at the really foundational level of government, at local government, I would be really interested in your thoughts on the challenges to investing in DRR at the local level, and particularly noting those hardships. How has Townsville been able to mobilise resources for risk reduction and building resilience?
There's been a couple of ways we've been able to do that, and this isn't a journey that begins now. This is a journey that's been happening at least 10 years since I've been mayor. So, and it really began around, firstly in 2012, when we were one of the first councils to look at what we call climate hazard adaptation study. Now, there'd been an event around a cyclone near us, and we were one of the first councils in Queensland in 2012 to participate in this study. And it was important because I think it started the foundation around, particularly for me as a new mayor, to understand what we needed to do. So as one of the first councils, we actually were funded through the state government, through our own resources, and with our local government association to look at both the present extremes of climate and also projected changes in future climates up until the year 2100. And this included the risk of ocean inundation for our community, storm tide events, the future effects of cyclonic and non-cyclonic events, also in terms of local level sea level rises. So, and what it would mean to the coast erosion. So it was a wide-ranging study. But what it did was it helped us to assess our vulnerability and risk to key council and community assets, how we needed to develop potential coastal adaptation options to mitigate the impacts of these possible hazards. And importantly, we needed to figure out whether we had to defend, retreat or accommodate for disaster events. So that really set the framework about 10 years ago. And since then, what we've been doing is a whole range of things. We now look at what I call smart planning, because with smart planning, you can also de-risk investment for the private sector. So we invest in a whole range of things now. We invest in our university cyclone testing station, because we know it's important that we know what products are suitable for our building industry. And this testing station in itself has influenced our building codes. So anywhere north of Rockhampton, we'll call it here in Australia, which is about 800 kilometres from Brisbane. And for those of you who don't know Townsville, we sit on the Great Barrier Reef and we're about 1,700 kilometres away from Brisbane, which is our capital city here. So we have different building codes now as a result of where we live. So homes have to be cyclone resilient. They have to be built. There's a level of governance to ensure that that happens. We've also, so we invest in that to ensure that we are kept up to date with building products and those sort of things. We also look at some of our plans around land use, stormwater inundation, sea level rises, how that would affect, how do we manage that with our property developers? How do we manage our assets? You know, as a result of the study, we've been looking at something as simple as stormwater drains. Now, many of our drains were built 100 years ago. Some of them have even collapsed. So we decided we needed to invest in understanding our current assets, our age of our infrastructure. What is the risk of failure? Is the risk related to climate change? And what does that mean for me as chair of the LDMG? Because if we can't drain away our stormwater effectively, what does that mean for urban flooding? You know, they're the simple things that we needed to work through. And by doing that, we give confidence to the private sector. One of the things, though, and around the event we had in 2019, we had a rainfall event which was equal to what they saw here in Brisbane and northern New South Wales this year. We had a similar event. And we were able to manage that event because 6 weeks earlier, we opened our new, what we call our local disaster coordination centre. So previously we worked out of a building that would have blown away in a Category 2 cyclone. It wasn't suitable. So we invested with support of state and federal governments in building a purpose-built centre. Now, out of that, we were able to then manage the event effectively to the point where no one died. We were able to rescue people. We were able to mobilise resources locally. Because in events like that, invariably you're cut off from support. And again, that helps to give confidence in our community that locally we can manage these events. So we do that locally, but we still have problems around planning. So and I'll be honest, this is a real life experience. We are in discussions with the state government who can override our planning scheme, and we are pushing back on them from developing an area that we know will cause flooding problems in other areas. Because of the tyranny of distance, sometimes bureaucrats still don't understand that what happens in certain areas, the way you develop certain areas, how it can affect places like Townsville that are built on a floodplain. So we're never going to stop the flooding. We're never going to stop the cyclones from coming. But what we can do is manage our land use better. What we can do is ensure our building codes can support our community through these events. And the other thing we can do is give comfort to our community that if an event happens, we can ensure that we will do everything in our power to minimise the loss of life.
Thank you very much for that, Mayor Hill. Very clear and very practical examples. And a couple of interesting things I'm hearing out of that are the way that you went into getting your ducks in alignment, your facts lined up on disaster risk resilience, rather than going to, I need this large piece of infrastructure to fix some particular person's problem. So the prioritisation of data, planning systems, and getting all of those basics in place first, I think, is a really important message from you. But also I'm hearing from you that you're putting your own money into this, the money that council is able to raise, as well as looking to other levels of government, be that state government or national government, to bring their share of financing to the problems as well. So thank you for that. I'll now introduce our next panellist, His Excellency Yujin Doji, who is Bhutan's Minister of Home and Cultural Affairs. And in fact, His Excellency has been a minister with various titles since 2018. And he was, in fact, I hope you don't mind me sharing, Bhutan's youngest minister, and named the Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum in 2020. So we're pleased to have you with us. Please welcome. Minister, your ministry covers both local government but also disaster management, which is an interesting thing to bring together, and I imagine a very good idea, really. It can be really challenging for governments to address climate and disaster risks because of this cross-sectoral nature. Lots of other ministries want to get involved and should get involved, but may have different ideas or may not want to get involved. You need finance and environment and public works, amongst others there, who are responsible for different elements. And given the dual responsibilities of your ministry, I'd be interested if you could speak to some of the challenges of financing disaster risk reduction efforts and how you've overcome this both on the national but also the local level.
Well, Emma, thank you for this very generous introduction, firstly. When you're talking about a small, landlocked, least developed country like Bhutan, and then when you're talking about the resources that are at disposal, you soon begin to realize that you don't have many options. Mm-hmm. The finance itself is a problem for a situation like ours. So with the very limited resources that we have, even if there is good enough political will on the part of the national leaders, it's very challenging. For example, our internal resources, the revenue generated internally, is barely enough to meet the recurrent expenses that the government needs on an annual basis, which means you end up relying on the overseas development assistance for all the other capital works. So, and which may not necessarily be aligned to disaster risk reduction targets. So that in itself, the scarcity of the resources, the limited resources that you have to deal with, is in itself a big challenge to begin with. But even to allocate the limited resources that you have in a manner that enhances the disaster risk reduction targets, it's difficult, like you rightly alluded to this problem of the cross-sectional nature of the mandate that you have when you're talking about the disaster risk reduction. In our case, we have Ministry of Works and Human Settlement, we have National Environment Commission, we have Gross National Happiness Commission, which is the central planning agency. We have the Ministry of Finance, under which is the Department of National Budget, which calls the shots when it comes to allocating the resources. We have the Department of Disaster Management under my ministry, an agency responsible for mainstreaming all this disaster risk reduction targets into the development plans, policies and programs, and the Department of Local Governance. But then these different departments and agencies and ministries do not necessarily work together. For example, even if the disaster department advocates for the disaster risk reduction targets in the development planning, because the planning is done by the Gross National Happiness Commission, the central planning agency, they may not really appreciate or feel the full value of the disaster risk reduction principles. And then even if these targets, principles are integrated into the plans, the Ministry of Finance, confronted with this limited resources at their disposal, may not find it that sensible to include the disaster risk reduction targets. So the problem also is in the process, the thinking, and the whole cycle itself. And finally, at the local level, we have 205 GEOCs, really the village blocks. When the resources spread thinly across all these 205 units of sub-districts, the resources are very minimal. And how do you invest those resources in a way that reduces the disaster risks, but at the same time brings about the development gains? Not necessarily from the disaster risk reduction, but also in terms of the construction of farm roads, in the form of the construction of school facilities, the medical facilities. So how do you prioritize the allocation of resources in this case? So these are all challenges. About how we have overcome these challenges, I would be a little hesitant to claim that we have overcome these challenges. But we do focus on few things. Because we know that the resources are limited, we go for a standalone investment projects. We try to keep it specific, but go for major ones. Like for example, we have the case, the imminent risk of the glacial lake outburst flood in the western part of the country. And we have been mitigating this problem for the last so many years. Because if we did not do that, downstream, we have two fortresses which are culturally, historically, socially, politically very significant for us. And then we have two major dams, two hydropower projects downstream. And then if this risk is not mitigated, something's not down up there in the mountains, the glacial lake, we risk losing all this, and that will be a major disaster. So we have been doing that, spending a lot of time and energy and resources to mitigate that. So standalone investment projects. Secondly, even on the resource allocation front, we're not doing really that badly, although it doesn't really feature in the form of a separate budget line or a separate fund. The disaster risk reduction targets are really embedded into the development activities in many ways. And at the local level also, there's enough sense and awareness and consciousness on the importance of managing the disaster so that the development gains can be sustained. And in this regard, I must make a mention of one very interesting financing mechanism. With the help of the UN CDF, we have been able to secure this pilot project whereby the UN CDF supports our local governments. Along with Cambodia, we are the other country in which this financing mechanism is piloted. And through this, we have been able to encourage, stimulate their thinking in the form of the grants that this fund gives to our local governments. Of the 205 local governments, in at least 100 local governments spread across 16 districts, we've been able to implement this over the last decade, and this has been very successful. The name of the scheme is called Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility. So that would entail construction of irrigation channels, building farm roads, the retaining walls, the water supply scheme, and all these sorts, which all adds to building resilience in the local communities to disaster and climate risk that it confronts on a daily basis. Daily basis, maybe, to say that it's on a daily basis may be too much, but every monsoon, every summer, you do confront these challenges, and all of this information come to my desk. And then after a while, you really feel like this is happening on a daily basis. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you, Minister. And I think a really interesting point about the importance of having an anchor in your national plan with targets to provide the strong push to live up to those targets, and the importance of financing at the local level too, of course. Our third panellist who's been waiting patiently is Dr. Marquisa Reyes, who is from the Philippines, and she's an assistant professor at the Asian Institute of Management in Manila. She's got a wide-ranging background, but she's led multi-country DRR and resilience building projects across Asia, just not just in the Philippines. So, Dr. Reyes, as your work shows, communities often know best what they need, and they often have a good understanding of the risks and how to manage them. From your experience, how can we ensure that funding does come down to the communities in a way that's commensurate with their risk profile? How does it move through from national government down to the community? And how can these different levels of government really work together to achieve a good outcome?
Okay. Thank you so much, Emma, for that. Those two questions that are, since yesterday I've been thinking about how to respond to. Because yes, achieving and sustaining community resilience is in the interest of the whole nation, not just of the communities, but the whole nation, the businesses, the local governments, and even individual citizens. But I've been pondering about that because what I've seen is that if that is the case, then why is it that resilient communities are actually more of an exception rather than the rule in the Philippines and in many developing countries? And so, so I've been thinking, so what is it that is needed in order for communities or resilient communities to become the norm rather than the exception? So, and I would like to make cite a good example about this. But before that, financing and investing in disaster risk reduction and resilience measures actually, when you think about it at the local level, and especially looking at the hard projects like infrastructure and making infrastructure climate and disaster resilient, I see two things. First, because many of these risks are already existing, are already there, particularly in highly urbanized areas in cities across developing countries. So this old infrastructure are actually centers of risk, right? And I call this legacy infrastructure. So what do local governments and communities do about these legacy infrastructures that, that they have already there existing and which causes, which exacerbates their vulnerability and therefore their disaster risk? Because one option or one solution is to retrofit this legacy infrastructures. But from the point of view of, let's say, optics, it's not really good, won't really provide good optics for the local authorities to retrofit legacy infrastructures. So then the alternative is to build new infrastructures that are climate and disaster resilient, which provide very good optics, right, and political mileage. But then there's a disincentive there. So what I'm saying is there are incentives and disincentives at work at the local level, and building disincentives in building resilient infrastructure, hard structural engineering measures. One of that is that the long gestation of these projects, which transcend political terms. So it may be difficult for for local government to see the investment that they have done or that they have made in order to, let's say, a flood control system, or even making climate resilient or disaster resilient roads. So it takes a long time to, for the project cycle, longer than the political terms. So that's one disincentive. But even if there are disincentives to retrofitting for, legacy infrastructures that are already there, or building resilient infrastructures, new resilient infrastructures, that may not be within the, political cycle, political timeline, the incentives are still there because there are leaderships at the local level and at the national level which has long-term vision, and they articulate that long-term vision of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, and therefore resilience building. So one example of this is that Makati City, which I've worked with for a long time. Makati City is one of the cities in Metro Manila. Metro Manila is the national capital region of the Philippines. And even before the typhoon that happened in 2009, Typhoon Ketsana, that wrought havoc in the national capital region. And even before the laws that came after that, the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act in 2010 and the Climate Change Act in 2009, the city of Makati has already started to resettle their informal settler families which were living along the river, Pasig River. This is a major river body, water body that crosses the whole capital region and drains into Manila Bay. So they have started resettling these informal settler families outside of the city. It's not on site in the city, but outside, but somewhere safe. And then they provided, of course, they provided housing and basic community services, basically rebuilding their communities outside, which are more resilient now because now they have all the basic services that they need, like health, schools, unlike when they were still living along the river, right? And so, and there goes like what the mayor said, that they invested in land use planning, so clearing up those floodplain areas along the river and zoning them as no-build zones. And then, of course, the relocation, resettlement of these informal settler families took a lot of resources, not only from the city of Makati, but also with the national government. So there was this, it's still ongoing. So they started around 2007, it's still ongoing right now. As I said, it's long gestation, long project cycle for these kinds of projects. So the national government came in. So both the national and local, have their skin in the game, so to speak. And so they provided financial and technical resources to the local government through the National Housing Authority, for example, and the Department of Public Works and Highways for helping them out with site development, etc. So, and of course, the local government, the city of Makati, has, of course, invested a lot of their own financial resources there. So what I'm saying is that, even if there are incentives and disincentives at work for, this kind of long-term, long gestation projects, many things can still happen as long as there's collaboration. So this is collaborative disaster risk governance across different levels of government, and even across sectors of government. And so for this to work, they have to institutionalize or put in place certain institutions and mechanisms, like special bodies, in order to take care of these projects. So another special body, for example, that the city of Makati has also institutionalized is the Climate Change Committee. Because even at the local level, as the minister said, the government works in silos, right? Even at the local level, that is the tendency. But in Makati, so there's the Local Disaster Risk Reduction Management Office, the city DRMO, and then you have the city engineer, the building official, the planning officer, etc. So now, because of the Climate Change Act in 2009, they created a special body called the Climate Change Committee, And it's not only within the departments in the local government, but also across sectors. Like my university is a member of that committee, together with the private sector. So this committee is a multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral committee, which meets time and again regarding the climate crisis. So that's how the Makati City actually tries to build resilience within its borders and outside its borders, right? Because if you think about it, river flooding along Pasig River is does not recognize political boundaries geographically, but many cities get flooded along the river, not just Makati City.
Yeah.
But with that kind of intervention, then the river flows better into the sea, and therefore lessens flooding for the neighboring cities along the river.
I think that's a really great example that you shared there, Dr. Reyes, and I think understanding local governments need to work together, the setting in place of structures and institutions to encourage continuity of this cooperation regardless of political changes, and hence the continuing financial flows needed to make that happen, I think is a really important example. And all the panelists have shared some positive examples of how things are being made to work in a range of different situations. But I think we're still seeing the situation where not enough money is being directed towards preparation for disasters and building resilience. So at this point, I might ask everyone to turn to your conference apps. If you go into this session, there's a heading that says poll, and you should be able to answer a question, and I will share with you that question. We've got some data from 2019, and we're wanting you to choose what percentage of official development assistance was allocated to countries with the primary purpose of reducing disaster risk. And you've got 4 choices there, so please choose whichever one you think is most accurate. And we've really focused on this. There's many developing countries in the audience here. Official development assistance is often a key part of government financing of investments. So the choices were 70%, 25%, 10%, or 1%. So when that poll is closed, it will come up on the screen and show us what the result is. And I think people may well be surprised by the result, or not, as the case may be. So is it working or not working? Keep voting. Has everyone voted? And there, we have some results. And you're obviously a very smart audience who has been listening well over the last few days. The answer was indeed 1%. We tried to trick you by not making it answer C, which is usually the case. But 1%, I mean, that's a tiny, tiny amount of money being directed to this cause, when normally, I understand, around 4 to 7% of ODA is directed towards post-disaster responses. So really big diversity in the intent, in the support given to DRR versus post-disaster responses. So at this time, I'm going to ask the panel, I've got a question for all of you around this business case for resilience. You've been talking about the benefits of it, but we see the money is not flowing. From your perspective, what is the responsibility of government to invest for multi-sector DRR? And what is the role of government in bringing private sector financing into DRR to help bring more money to that? Anyone want to volunteer to answer that question first? Minister, you're looking at me.
Well,
so
since I come from government, I think the role of the government to really invest in multi-sectoral disaster risk reduction, I think is very evident, because it has to be the government. It is about disasters, not some other areas where there are returns to investment upfront. So I think this sort of an investment will have to be made by the government. But like I already indicated earlier, I think the priorities, the government's priorities must be reset in a way that the disaster risk reduction agenda gets the priority in the government decisions. So the role of the government is not just about resetting the priorities. It has to be about mobilizing adequate resources and ultimately allocating adequate resources. And once the resources are allocated in adequate measure, I think the next step really will have to be to make sure that these resources are invested in areas that they are supposed to be invested in, meaning to really reduce the disasters, whether you're talking about earthquakes, flash floods, or some other disasters that you can think of, and the risk associated with those. So the role of the government really will have to be about really shifting that thinking from spending on disaster response and recovery, like the polls rightly indicated. The thinking has to shift from investing in responses and recovery to really investing in disaster risk reduction, to shift that investment from response and recovery to reduction. About the role of the government to encourage the private sector, it's a little difficult to imagine that the private sector would somehow come to mitigate and take care of all this disaster risks that are out there, all sorts of risks. But then in their own ways, private sector too have a role in this. And in this, the government, as usual, through regulatory frameworks, through incentives, through technical assistance and advice that it could provide the private sector entities, may not necessarily in terms of providing funding for construction of roads, which the government does, private sector is involved, but in that, since it's the government's job, I think the disaster risk reduction targets would automatically be embedded into that. But in cases like the construction of buildings or the private infrastructure in cities, for example, through regulatory requirements for them to obtain environmental clearances, for example, which is what we do in Bhutan. All the developmental activities will have to go through environment impact assessments, meaning it does take care of the risk analysis and the assessments that has to go before the public investment is made. So that is taken care. So for example, the building codes, like the professor earlier already mentioned. So through this kind of regulatory roles, also by creating incentives, the fiscal incentives. For example, so if you are talking about this disaster in a very broad term, the electric vehicles, the use of electric vehicles, this is something that Bhutan is experimenting in collaboration with the World Bank. We are encouraging the private individuals to buy electric taxis. So at least 300 taxis. We are in the process of implementing the 300 taxis project, electric taxis in a project, to encourage people to use electric vehicles, to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, the fuels. So this sort of it may not be seen as that disaster in the conventional sense, but in a way it is. Talking about climate change, talking about over-reliance on the fuels for these vehicles. I think that is not a very typical example, a very conventional example, but in a way it does fit into this, this idea of really the government and the private sector working together to encourage the private sector to invest in disaster risk reduction.
Can I just, at a local level, I mean, that's national levels, they will think about these things, but at a local level for us, when a disaster is happening, one of the first things that gets cut off is your electricity. And we know that when that happens, your mobile networks fail, your risk of public health goes through the roof because your pump stations aren't working for your sewage or your water. So this is going to be a problem as we move forward, move out of fossil fuels into hopefully battery powers and things like that and electric vehicles. But it's an issue that we have to address, because if people can't charge their mobile phones and don't have a mobile network, then how are you going to get the messages out to them about what's happening? Because in disasters, part of the risk is not being able to communicate with your community. And as we progress with technology, technology is great, except when it fails. And when it fails, it is a problem. It's a major problem. It's a major problem in hospitals. It's a major problem trying to move people from point A to point B, because you cannot communicate which roads are open, where you've got to evacuate, to get the message, to get people out. And I think we've got to try and build resilience in the system so we can mitigate the risks to life of our community during disaster events. So it's about understanding. We now have generator sets on all our sewage pump stations, and many of them sit 6 foot high, so that if a flood comes through, they can still operate. We talk about having 3 days of fuel resilience. We tell our community, your power's going to be off for 3 days, so learn to cook on a barbecue. You may not have fresh water. You've got to store your own fresh water. And we are a first world nation. But we still have to build that resilience in. We run a weekend, we run a day, a community day, to engage our community, particularly new people who move up, in training them around disaster resilience, about what you have to do when the power's off for 3 days, minimum 3 days. What do you do in terms of water? What do you do about canned food? Make sure your barbecue has got gas is refilled, so, because your fridge isn't going to be operating, so you're going to be cooking everything as much as you can. So we are moving towards different fuels. One of the questions we've asked electric vehicle makers is, at what level can you drive an electric vehicle through flooded roads? Because right now, to a certain level, we can drive diesel vehicles through, but at what level has it become unsafe to drive an electric vehicle? And no one can answer me that question.
So I think you're quite right. Setting policy requirements, understanding, bringing in your communities are all quite vital to having people more resilient to disasters and enabling governments to make those investments. I recognise we're running through time here, and there's a few questions coming in. So perhaps at this stage I'll ask people to come up if they want to ask questions, come up to microphones and ask questions. But in the meantime, an interesting question has come in from Didier Guana, who's asking if any of the panellists were able to share an experience or example related to public investment that relates to children and youth, getting them ready for disasters and building their resilience to disasters. I will actually start things off on that. We were involved in what we call policy-based lending in the Pacific, working with the Cook Islands in particular, who wanted to have a credit stream with us for after disasters. To access that finance post-disaster, we worked with them to undertake a series of policy actions ahead of the disaster so they would be more resilient. And a lot of that was around working with their schools and building into the curriculum understandings of disasters and how to act in the case of disasters, practicing evacuations in the case of tsunami or cyclones, what needed to be done. And I think these are things that need to be thought through to bring people from the earliest age into that sort of disaster readiness mindset. Not often very expensive investments, but quite critical ones that can actually help save lives. But perhaps others have some other examples of things that are working with children and youth and investments that are critical there.
Well, we run a Get Ready Day, and we try to make it a day where kids can wander on top of fire engines and play with chainsaws with the SES and the sort of things that Australian kids love to do. But it is really about trying to engage them. So they'll hear a cyclone warning siren, So they'll understand what that means. But it is something that I don't think we do well in Australia in terms of engaging, and it's something that we seriously do need to look at as we move into the next phase with climate change.
Yeah. Thank you. No, that's good. Now we have someone coming up for a question. Please let us know who you are and direct your question. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Parsu Sharma Luitel. I live in Melbourne for the last 20 years, originally from Bhutan. I'm the chairperson of the Refugee Communities Association of Australia. My observation and question is to Your Excellency Ugendoji, the Minister. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we have understand that Bhutan was one of the forefront to lead from zero jab to being the world leader in vaccine rollout drive in just 3 weeks of time. To my understanding, the knowledge, this was possible with the mobilization of DESUP program called the Guardian of Peace, who are trained citizens from every walks of life to respond during the disaster. In this regard, Your Excellency, if you consider that the model has been proven successful in Bhutanese context, to effectively respond to the disaster pandemic, do you have any specific message or good practice to share to the rest of the countries in the region to benefit the approach taken by the landlocked, least developed country like Bhutan, where the majority of the area is not accessible by road? Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Thank you for that very thoughtful question. Definitely, when we talk about the disaster risk reduction and the constraints in terms of the funding available to meet the reduction targets, I think what we tend to forget it really is the more non-financial measures that you can resort to reduce disaster risks. And one of the ways in which we managed to do, and really an example of how we have prioritized disaster risk reduction than response and reconstruction and recovery side, really is about the way we managed to handle the COVID-19 in the last 2.5 years to 3 years. We went all out to reprioritize all our developmental activities. The budget allocated, the budget reprioritization in terms of moving the budget allocated to certain developmental activities to really investing in managing the COVID, in paying for the border management measures, in paying for the quarantine facilities, the lockdowns. Even when the businesses had to close, the relief measures that the government provided to the citizens in terms of the loan waiver, the interest waiver, in terms of the loan deferrals, in terms of the cash transfers to the people specifically and predominantly from the tourism sector, some 15,000, 16,000 of them who were laid off. But overall, the number went up to 40,000, 50,000. So we invested heavily in this. And then we invested in the purchase of vaccines because we were all out for vaccine. We got it. And despite all these challenges, I'm proud to say that we, most people, I would say more than 90% of the people had the 4th round of the COVID vaccine already. So we were pretty safe in Bhutan. So in terms of saving lives, except for few lives, few precious lives, but with comorbid conditions who we could not save. Despite the infection number of about 60,000, 70,000, only few lives were lost. So this is a clear example of how, by investing in disaster risk reduction, we were able to reap the benefits of such investments. But about the DESUM program, the DESUM program really is the brainchild of His Majesty the King. Essentially, is a way of mobilizing the younger generation, especially, would undergo a few weeks of training, discipline, would be trained in disaster and relief operations. So they themselves would be ready and would be resilient to these disaster events, but they go a bit beyond that. Wherever there are flash floods, forest fires, earthquakes, wherever they are required. The number now, for a small population of 700,000 people, the population of 30,000, more than 30,000 DESUPs who are trained, is a significant number. And they're there to take care of all these disaster events and incidences, and that kind of makes Bhutan much more resilient to disaster. And an example of, yes, finances are involved, you spend money there, but it's more a non-financial monetary way of making yourself resilient to disaster and climate risk. Yeah. So if this is the there's any example, a lesson that other developing small landlocked or island nation states could draw from us, this is the story that we have, and I would be willing to share this story in greater detail if you're interested after this session. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Minister. And I think you make a good point that yes, financial investments, but also investments in building capacity and systems are quite critical also. Do we have someone else with a question now? Thank you. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Sylvia from Australian insurance sector. In IPCC reports or the current scientific researches, climate projections are made with very long-term time horizons, usually 30 to 80 years. There's large uncertainty with the projections that's made and when we will reach the 2-degree or 3-degree temperature increases. It is a common challenge for the private sector or public sector to interpret the long-term climate predictions into institutional strategy, business strategy, or even capital strategy. Is there any lessons that can be learned from the panelists in terms of setting climate science-informed mitigation strategies? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And I think that's a good question perhaps for you, Dr. Reyes, with your work in the Philippines. You've
Right.
been closely involved in climate change planning there.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, maybe not just for climate change mitigation, but also for climate change adaptation, if I may. So yes, in the Philippines, I also work with the Climate Change Commission, particularly on the area of climate finance. And when we talk about climate finance, we look at the projections not only of the science, the different RCPs, the different pathways, but also what it would mean in terms of resources that would be needed for these different pathways. So of course we look at not the worst case scenario, but the most probable probable scenario, given that there's business as usual, for example. So based on that, we know that we need a lot of financial resources in order for to help communities and people to adapt to this climate change in different sectors, whether in agriculture or in urban sectors. So what we have been trying to do with the Climate Change Commission is to prepare the local governments to be climate finance ready, and not just the local governments, but also the private sector. And when I say climate finance ready, because there are internal resources within the government, but that's never enough. So we have to look outside the Philippines and tap into this international climate finance flows. And this is one of the advocacies that I'm also doing to integrate the private sector, the business sectors into this climate finance architecture that includes not just the Philippines, but more so the financing mechanisms for the Paris Agreement, like the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the GEF, Global Environment Fund, and tap into this climate flows for the Philippines. We are still not there. We are just in the beginning of this climate finance readiness, but for the private sector more so. With the public sector, with the local governments, the internal funds for this has been allotted by the government. It's called the People's Survival Fund, which is a 1 billion peso revolving fund. But that 1 billion pesos will only benefit a few local governments in the Philippines. So therefore, we need to mobilize and unlock the climate finance flows internationally, and that's what we've been trying to do.
Thank you for that. Yes, I think certainly mobilising beyond your borders to enable you to implement those plans that you've put in place is quite critical. Perhaps we have time for one last question here.
Thanks very much. My name is Scott Hook. I'm at the UNDP Fiji multi-country office. My question relates to, I guess, as costs continue to rise, we talk about obviously that the resources needed to protect and fortify, enhance infrastructure, but there's obviously finance resources that we're dealing with, and ministries of finance obviously emphasise the importance of efficiency and effectiveness of those funds, but the costs of climate change, as we've just been hearing, continue to rise. So I guess the question is, at what point does the net benefit and cost move to a point where we can no longer continue to adapt and enhance and work with those risks that they're facing? Obviously, Townsville, for example, as the Mayor was saying, built in a floodplain. That risk with regard to it will continue to rise over time because of climate change. And then obviously, Minister, with regard to Bhutan, the impacts of glacial melts will increase as a consequence of accelerated temperature rises as a consequence of climate change, putting additional pressures both on the impact of floods, but also water supply going forward. So I guess the thing is, if we're no longer able to adapt, what does happen going forward? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and it's a big one to end on. And it's really, at what point is it too expensive to build resilience, and do you have to back away, I expect? And does anyone want to tackle that very quickly?
Well,
You're thinking about it, Mayor, so please go ahead.
well, I know when we did our climate hazard adaptation study, the view was we had to build a levee bank. Now, I don't think that will happen in my lifetime, but it may be the ultimate solution to the problem around sea level rises. All we can do is try and, as we move through renewal of assets, to see what we can do to try and mitigate some of the effects. We're using mapping at the moment and how we have urban development, what we do with our coastal areas where we have discrete communities that literally sit on top of sand dunes that will probably be underwater within the next 80 years if climate change continues at the rate it does. So all we can do is educate our community around those risks and then let them decide what they want to do.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And I think we're in a situation of sort of continuing cost-benefit analysis of each various option on the table, and that the numbers keep shifting, and we have to keep adjusting our decisions and what is the next best thing to focus on.
And Emma, if I may?
Please go ahead.
According to this World Bank study, it's only 3%. If you want to build resilience into the infrastructure system in particular, the incremental cost or the extra cost of building that is 3% of the overall investment cost. 3% of the overall investment cost. Now, having said that, regarding risk reduction, because I always tell my students that we can never totally eliminate risks, and therefore you always have residual risk, and that's why you have residual risk management, and that includes risk financing strategies, including insurance. And of course, there's response, and that's why you need very effective response, because the risk may be realized, and you need those response capacities, the absorptive capacities, and then you need to also invest in recovery and reconstruction. But in the field of climate change, for example, and the good mayor mentioned that there are already, climate change is already locked in. No matter what we do, it's already locked in. We're going to experience all these climate change impacts. We can only mitigate through, by transitioning to non-renewable, to renewable energy sources from fossil fuels. But the adaptation part of it, for sea level rise, for example, there's already managed retreat strategies for coastal communities, and that has been done in the Philippines after a catastrophic disaster. And I'm talking about Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. So there's this municipality there, municipality of Hernani, which was devastated by the storm surge brought about by, because of stronger typhoons due to the changing climate. And now they're doing this managed retreat.
Constant planning and replanning.
Right, so they have moved away from the coast, their municipal hall, community centers and schools into another safer location within the province.
Thank you for that. And recognize we're coming very close to the end of our time. I'm just going to take a few seconds to wrap up and try and repeat some of the gems that we've heard from our very distinguished panel this afternoon. I think the clear message is disaster risk reduction is about people, and it's about the people who you're trying to protect and getting them to understand their situation, be aware, and know how to look after themselves. And it's ensuring that government at different levels can come in and help to meet these particular needs so that there's not lone voices talking about disaster risk reduction, but it's a coordinated whole across various levels of government. Expanding financing has clearly come through right from the local level through to the international level. More finance is needed for this important thing. And one critical thing, I think, is understanding the data, monitoring the outcomes, and as we've heard this afternoon, sharing some of the success stories that give us hope that there is real benefits in disaster risk reduction and more financing will come. So please join me in thanking our panel, Mayor Hill, His Excellency, Dr. Reyes. Thank you. Thank you, panel. Thank you, audience, for joining us as well. Thank you.